Bowling is a game that can be enjoyed by pretty much everyone, from young children to people in their 90s. The game offers something for everybody. However, that doesn't mean it's as accessible for those wishing to pursue a career in bowling. It now feels like it's turned into a rich man's game, and I know it's probably always been a bit like this, but it just seems to be becoming more of an issue in my opinion. And if you want a hope of being able to compete at a high level, you're going to need some deep pockets. There are a number of reasons why bowling has become inaccessible to many, and we're going to look at some of the main reasons in this video. Firstly, it's an expensive hobby. Even if you're just a casual league bowler, bowling has quickly become an expensive hobby, with the equipment being the main expense. Here in the UK, a new ball with drilling is going to set you back at least £200, which equals around $240. I suspect that for those of you in the US, it might be a little bit cheaper than this. I know a lot of bowlers in Europe envy the fact that balls are a lot cheaper generally in the US to buy, but when you take into account all of the shipping and import costs, it basically works out the same price as if you just bought them from a pro shop in your own country. But either way, bowling balls are still expensive, and even if you're a league bowler who maybe bowls occasional tournaments, you're still going to need a good set, which could easily set you back $1,000. And it's not like these balls last forever, far from it. With new balls coming onto the market that all claim to be bigger and better than their predecessors, it can be hard not to be tempted to upgrade some of your old equipment once they have seen their fair share of games. When you add in the costs of leagues every week, and of course bowlers play multiple leagues per week, the cost of practice, coaching, travel and tournaments, entries, well, suddenly it becomes a huge outlay. And if a bowler has decided they want to pursue bowling and take it seriously, then perhaps it's slightly easier for them to justify making this investment. But now we live in a world where money is tight for everybody, and for the casual bowler, I think it's becoming harder and harder to justify these huge expenses. People just can't afford it right now, and everyone is looking to cut back and make savings. If you're a twice a week league bowler, you might decide to cut back to just one league, or maybe even stop altogether. These rising costs, I think, are definitely starting to turn people away from the sport. It's not like football where you can just grab a ball and a bit of grass and just get playing with your friends. To be a bowler means having to spend money, and quite a lot of it too. But as the economy improves and we finally get over the cost of living crisis, things will change. And people will have money to spend on other things apart from the essentials. But until then, it's getting harder and harder to throw away $200 on a bowling ball when people are barely managing to pay their heating bills. The next problem is a lack of prize fund. This is a huge one, especially if you are a regular tournament bowler. It's a catch-22 situation because tournaments are generally struggling to get the entry numbers to create the big prize funds. But you can't really convince people to play without the lure of a big top prize, and without the entry numbers, you can't get that top prize. So you are in a bit of an impossible situation. I've seen a few tournaments in the past that have guaranteed a certain prize fund and then fallen way short of the prize fund, and the organisers or the sponsors were just left to foot the bill. So tournament organisers can't take that risk. You have all the expenses I mentioned earlier, plus the tournament fees, travel costs, sometimes even hotels or accommodation. And in a lot of cases, it basically means you have to win the event to make it worthwhile financially. And this creates a huge problem. If money isn't really an issue to you, then it's not a problem if you go and play tournaments regularly and just manage to break even. But for someone who's trying to make a living, well, this just isn't going to work. I've seen many comments on my videos stating how the purses for PBA events and women's events too have dropped significantly, or if they haven't dropped, they've basically stayed the same for a number of years and have not increased to account for inflation. Now, all the work, money and dedication that these pros put in, and I look, and not even pros, even people trying to make that step, I look at them and I just wonder how half of them survive. If you're a top 10 PBA player, then you're going to have a pretty decent life. Win a couple of majors and that sets you up for the next couple of seasons at least. And if you're someone like EJ Tackett or Jason Beaumonte, etc., then you can make pretty decent money, and as I said, you'll have a good life bowling. But obviously those players are in the very, very small minority. And okay, those players that are making the top money, it's still far, far less than other sports. But bowling is a minority sport, so that's just the way it is. But for other players who are on the fringe or trying to make it as a pro, have a real problem. If you can't make it in the first couple of years, well, you're basically just burning money. You might make a few cashes here and there, but that's barely going to cover your costs. It's not a wage. There's no way for these players to cut their teeth and work their way up, unless they can afford to support themselves. Again, it's a catch-22. You need the experience, but there's basically no money to be made during this period of learning, but you can't afford not to be earning money. But then you'll never make it unless you stick it out. So players are being forced to make these incredibly tough decisions about whether they essentially risk it all to try and make it on tour. And it just shouldn't really be like that, because there needs to be a way to give bowlers a chance to make it on the tour. Otherwise you could easily end up in the future with it just being filled with the rich and well connected. My point is, how is a bowler meant to try and improve so they can compete with the pros? They have to gain experience by playing these tournaments against them. But not only are these expensive, but to begin with, you're very, very unlikely to cash regularly in these events. And this just adds enormous pressure to bowlers trying to make it on the tournament scene. So when you take all of this into account, it's clear that it's expensive even when bowling is just a hobby. But trying to break it into the tournament scene either as a high-ranking amateur or on the PBA tour, well, it's going to be an expensive investment. Because in order to make any sort of half-decent money, you're basically going to have to be winning events regularly. But this just isn't realistic for many. So this leaves you a couple of options. You either have to be prepared to spend the money and just accept that in all likelihood you're probably not going to make much of it back. But unfortunately most of us aren't millionaires with money to burn, so eventually bowlers will have to weigh up the pros and cons and decide if it's worth spending thousands and thousands of dollars when they're facing the cold hard truth that they probably aren't going to make a decent income unless they're at the very top of the pro tour. But is there a solution to all this? Well, there actually might be, because snooker is actually very similar to bowling. So there might not be many snooker fans watching this, but essentially snooker was absolutely huge in the UK in the 70s and 80s, but since then it's basically now in a similar situation to bowling. The very top players like Ronnie O'Sullivan are making fantastic money, but for those outside of the top 16, it's a real struggle to make a living as a pro snooker player. As an example, in many snooker tournaments, if you exit in the first round, you don't get paid anything. Now you have to qualify for these events, so players will enter into the qualifying stage, and then a certain amount of players will then make it through to the main event. So you would think that once a player qualifies for the main event, they really should deserve some financial reimbursement, especially when these events that just hold maybe like 32 players or maybe even like 64 sometimes, but they are whittled down to quite small fields. So there was an instance once where one player was drawn against Ronnie O'Sullivan in the first round 3 tournaments in a row. For those of you unfamiliar with snooker, O'Sullivan is the #1 ranked player in the world and is basically considered the best player of all time. So this unfortunate player exited out of 3 tournaments in a row, which meant he did not earn any money at all because he was unfortunate enough to be drawn against the best player in the world 3 times in a row. And actually one snooker player, Ali Carter, spoke about this last month, saying that 90% of players were earning nothing. Basically, they're only earning about £20,000 per year, and as a comparison, he said you would earn about the same amount working in a supermarket, and he's absolutely right. How can a professional sportsman who are regularly performing on TV be taking home the same amount of money as somebody stacking shelves? Now, no disrespect to any of you supermarket workers out there, but bowling is in the same position, it seems. But to be fair, the World Snooker Tour, they have done something to try and fix this problem. They've brought in a new scheme that I think goes a long way to resolving the issues of athletes struggling to earn a living. All 130 players who are on the World Snooker Tour will be guaranteed a minimum earnings of £20,000 per season. So, okay, it's not loads of money, but it acts as a safety net for players. They've worked incredibly hard to become a pro on the tour. They've earned that status, and now they have this guaranteed income that will at least cover their main bills and their expenses to be able to play in the majority of tournaments each season. This takes a huge amount of pressure off, as they're no longer playing with the goal of cashing in events just to survive. And I think the PBA really does need to look at bringing in a similar scheme. Now obviously they aren't going to pay every PBA member $30,000 a year, but here's a proposal I came up with that I think could work quite well. For those of you who remember, the PBA used to be an exempt tour. So 64 bowlers competed in most weekly events, but bowlers had to earn the exemption to get onto the tour. And they would do this by winning tournaments during the previous season. If they won a major tournament, that would give them a multi-year exemption. And there were other ways that you could qualify for an exemption place on the tour, such as some of the top finishes in points. If you led a region on the PBA regional tour, if you finished in a certain position on the PBA tour trials, etc. So the exemption tour was criticised at the time as a number of players, high profile players, started to fall off the tour after having a bad season. But what I would suggest is that we look at bringing back the exemption tour in a slightly different form. Let's say you once again have exemption places, but these spots would be for guaranteed income for that season. Other players who were not exempt would still be able to play the tour, but these exemption spots would give players a chance to earn somewhat of a regular income. It would give amateurs and other players a chance to progress on the tour, especially if you opened up some spots where players could qualify through things like certain maybe amateur tournaments or the regional tour. It would as well, players would have to earn the right to be an exempt player, and that way they absolutely should be rewarded financially for this. But of course, the question that you're probably all going to ask is, well, how do you fund something like this? Well, I'm not quite sure how Snooker has managed to do it, to be honest, but if they can do it, why can't the PBA come up with a similar scheme? I would imagine there must be some way to raise money to be able to create some exemption spots. I mean, the Snooker is paying 120 players. I very much doubt the PBA could pay any more than kind of 30 odd players maybe, but I think that would be certainly an ideal solution. And if you had almost like a PBA amateur circuit that would allow players to qualify and then become exempt, well, that's just another way to kind of raise funds, I guess, and fund this idea. I don't know, it's just an idea, sort of thinking out loud, but I do think we have a big problem, and that problem is that bowling really just remains a rich man's game. And for players who are not pros and they're trying to break onto the circuit, it's a huge problem, because you're having to spend all of this money, and not only are you spending all of this money, you're entering into tournaments that really are so top heavy in terms of the prize fund that you're going to have to go and beat pros to win. Even if you look outside of the PBA tour, you look at some of the tournaments in Europe, you still get basically pro level players, and you still do get PBA pros going over to Europe, playing these tournaments in Europe, because they know they're good enough to cash in a high enough position to make it worth their while. But that leaves all of the other bowlers who want to go and play these tournaments in Europe, and even if they want to do it for a bit of fun, it very quickly just doesn't become worth it, because they're literally having to spend thousands to travel, to bowl. I mean, a lot of these tournaments can cost up to like $200 for one entry, and then they're re-entry tournaments, so you're going to have to re-enter at least a couple of times in most cases. So suddenly it's a huge expense. And the harsh reality is, for most of us, if you're not at a pro level, you're not regularly going to be able to compete at the level that allows you to make enough money to fund this kind of dream, I guess, of bowling full time. But yeah, so that's why I do like this, what Snooker have done. I have to applaud them and say, well, you know, fair enough. They've not just ignored the problem, they're doing something about it. And I really hope the PBA can come up with something, you know, a similar scheme or some idea, something that just gives players a chance really to survive. But yeah, let's bring a close to this video. I'd just like to say thank you very much for everyone who has watched and subscribed so far and supported the channel. Thank you very much. Please do let me know, as always, in the comments below what you think about my idea for this PBA wage, should we say. And also, you know, please do let me know your opinions on how you think we can solve this problem. Thank you very much once again for watching. Thank you, bowling fans, and see you all next time.